How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Tes, Daf 39 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, Daf 39 is unbelievable. Daf 39 is unbelievable. This is like the tzitzis daf. It's like the tzitzis daf. How to make tzitzis. How do tzitzis become puzzle? Which garments need tzitzis? What are the strings made out of? Unbelievable. It's like the other day on, I think, Daf Lamed Hey, we learned about how to make tefillin. Today, how to make tzitzis. We're going to see treles, the different shitas of tying treles, Tosfos, Rambam, Ravid. Unbelievable daf. This is like unbelievable. It's like anything you wanted to know about. Not anything you wanted to know, but it's like tzitzis. This is tzitzis in a daf. What do you want me to tell you? It's unbelievable. So, friends, on today's daf, we're going to learn about what to do if tzitzis strings break. That's going to be at the beginning. Very, very important question, right? What happens if a string breaks on one of your tzitzis? Is the tzitzis still kosher or puzzle? It's a trickier question than it sounds like. It's a trickier question than it sounds like. It sounds like it should be a simple answer. It is and it isn't. We're going to see. We're going to see what the halacha is there. How to tie tzitzis. Unbelievable. How to tie tzitzis. Treles. Different shitas. Right? All people have all sorts of different shitas when it comes to tying treles tzitzis. We're going to see a few of them. What are they based on? What are like the minimum requirements for tying tzitzis? What do we do practically speaking when nowadays the assumption is that we don't have treles? Obviously, there is treles and many people have treles, but we're still operating with this assumption from the time of the Rishonim already that like tzitzis don't have treles, to the extent that, you know, the Shulchan Aruch, I don't even think the Shulchan Aruch even writes about how to tie. I don't think that the Shulchan Aruch writes about how to tie tzitzis with treles. The Shulchan Aruch writes about how to tie tzitzis without treles. So we're going to discuss how to tie tzitzis. What are some considerations when it comes to treles? What about when you're not using treles? Unbelievable. Which materials are chayav in tzitzis? Are all materials chayav in tzitzis? Maybe only wool and linen. We're going to see. We're going to see. Not pashut at all. Big question. Which materials to use for the tzitzis threads? What are the strings made out of? Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. Friends, let's jump into Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we're going to begin on Daf Lamed Ches Amid Beis, about 4 or 5 lines before it gets wide. A little bit, honestly, on most days I probably would have gone a little bit further, but yesterday I was just rushing to get one more page in. And I'll tell you, I'm like, actually a little like, it's kind of good that I did it because it's right now 4:30 in the afternoon. Normally I would be recording at like 7, 8, 9 in the morning, trying to get out the daf as soon as possible. It makes me a little nervous because, like, am I already falling behind? I hope not. I don't plan to fall behind. This isn't exactly a brick wall. This is just such an incredible daf that I like. It's like a once in a 7.5 year daf that I wanted to make sure that we did it properly with whatever the things we need to look at, and I really wanted to. Also, I promised you from yesterday, because yesterday I ran through the daf and I told you. I gave you my word. I said, we at Babble on Talmud are not going to lose out one bit from the fact that I rushed through the daf yesterday. And I'm keeping to my word. I still haven't learned that big Tosfos yet, but I want to. But I made sure to do this daf k'moshe tzarich for all my friends at Babble on Talmud so that we can do this properly. Okay. Lamed Ches Amid Beis, about 4 or 5 lines before it gets wide. Umantana the Polygola de Rebbe. Yesterday we saw the opinion of Rebbe, who says that the treles and the lavan are ma'akev, right? That you need both. You need 2 strings of treles and 2 strings of lavan. So who argues with Rebbe? Hi Tana, the following Tana, who Desani that we learned in the Brayso of Yitzchak, says of Yitzchak Mishum of Nosin, Shamim Mishum of Yosei Glili, Shamim Mishum of Yochanan ben Nuri. I guess ultimately Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Ein lo treles matil lavan. If you don't have treles nishgeferlach, use lavan, use white strings instead. So that argues with Rebbe, who says that you have to have 2 strings. Well, it's machlokes how many strings taka, but hopefully we'll get to that. Hopefully I'll remember to get to that. I should remember to get to that later when we get to treles. Anyways, Rebbe's opinion was you need treles and you need lavan. The opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is that if you don't have treles, so use lavan instead. Amar Rava says, Rava, Shma mina tzarich likshor al kol chulia v'chulia. Rava wants to argue that you have to tie on every chulya. So maybe this is a good opportunity for us to pull up a slide over here about the different components of tzitzis, so that we can kind of get the phrase, get the terms, get on the same page with terms over here. Okay, so we have over here just a standard lavan, a standard white tzitzis. On the left, there is the gold arrow pointing to kind of the whole, what's called gedil. That's kind of all the knots and the wraps and all that kind of, right? That part of the tzitzis, like the tying part, is called the gedil. Now, within, and maybe now we'll say, okay, and as opposed to the gedil, there is the dark green arrow is pointing to these strings that come out from the right on the other side of the gedil, the strings that hang down, which is what's called either the ptil, the gedil, and the ptil. Alternatively, it's referred to also in the Gemara and in the Shulchan Aruch and the Rishonim as anaf. So you have all the knots and stuff, and then after you're done tying everything, you have a whole bunch of extra string. That string is there by design, as we're going to learn about a little bit later. So you have the gedil, which is all the knots and things, and then you have the ptil, which is all the excess thread, let's call it that, but that just kind of, all those strings. Basically, when you think of tzitzis, in a sense, you think of the tzitzis strings, that's the ptil, but all those strings that hang down. Now, within the gedil, you have the pink arrow is pointing to keshers, ksharim, knots. You have knots within the gedil. And the blue arrow is pointing to what's called the chulya, which is what we're talking about right now. So if you notice, so the chulya is basically the wrapping in between the knots, okay? So what Rava just said, he's arguing, like we see in this photo, that each chulya requires its own knot, as we see in the photo. This photo would align with what Rava is saying, with what Rava is saying right now. So again, first wide line of Lamed Ches Amud Beis. Omar Rava says Rava Shmamino, that it must be that Sarich Likshor al Kol Chulya v'Chulya, that you need to tie a knot for each and every Chulya. The Isa Tadaitich Lo Tzarich. How come? Because if you would say no, you don't need to tie a knot for every single Chulya. You just need one knot at the end. That's it. Just one knot at the end. That's it. Hada'ami b'nei Reb Chia. But that which we saw yesterday, and that we also saw a few days before that, what did they say? Where was the previous time? Leil daf lamed hey amud beis. Gardume tcheles ksherin b'gardume ezov ksherin. That if the tzitzis strings get stumped, right? If the ptil, now that we have the words, we can use them. The ptil, the strings after the gedil, if the ptil gets cut all the way down, so they said that the stumps are kosher. We had seen yesterday you have to be able to tie it. I think Tosfos says that maybe Rava doesn't agree with that. Well, okay, without getting into it, Rava argues that since the Bnei Reb Chia said that the tzitzis are kosher even if the strings get cut down to the gedil, well then, Kevin the ishtrile Eloi ishtrile kula. The thing is, okay, so the Bnei Reb Chia say that if the string gets cut down, and Rava seems to be saying gets cut down to the gedil, and there's basically no string left, so they're saying it's still kosher. The thing is that if you only have one knot there, and now that there's basically no string left, and the knot comes undone, the whole tzitzis are going to unravel. So Rava wants to argue that from the fact that the Bnei Reb Chia say that a stumped tzitzis is nonetheless kosher, it must mean that there are more knots than just one knot at the end. So that way, if it gets stumped and then the knot opens up, there's still other knots that are holding things together. That's what Rava wants to argue. From the fact that stumped tzitzis are kosher, it must mean that there are multiple knots to be able to stop the unraveling of the tzitzis in the event of stumping. Answers the Gemara, not necessarily. Maybe you don't actually need more than one tzitzis. You don't need more than one knot. Maybe what the Bnei Reb Chia are saying is that in the event that you did have more than one knot, that you did have multiple knots. In that case, if the tzitzis got cut down to the gedil and now the knot opens up, it will still be kosher because you have more knots. In the event that you only have one knot, well then, yeah, it would be a problem. They wouldn't say it's kosher in that case. Dilma the ikater, right? Maybe the Bnei Reb Chia are only saying that stumps are kosher in the event that you did have multiple, let's call them backup knots, but you don't necessarily need to have them. V'omar Ravin, says Ravin, Shmamino Kesher Elyon deoraisa. Okay, Rave also wants to argue, this time seemingly successfully, that the Kesher Elyon is midoraisa. What's the Kesher Elyon? I have a slide over here. I'm not sure if I necessarily need a slide here, but why not? It'll help if you're watching. Here it is. The blue arrow is pointing to the Kesher Elyon. The Kesher Elyon is basically the Kesher at the end of the Gedil. It's the Kesher at the end of the Gedil, not the Kesher that is right by the Beged, right by the garment. No, it's at the opposite end, right before the Patil. Okay? If you have the photo, you can, photos better than 1,000 words or whatever. So, if you have the photo, just take a look. So, okay. Givaldik. I think it's probably Taka Machlokas because we're going to see some photos later on of how the Rambam tied Tcheles and he has one knot all the way by the Beged. So, anyways. But Rashi says that the Kesher Elyon is a reference to the knot at the end of the Gedil, as you can see in the photo. Not the side closer to the garment, the other side. Okay. Now, so again, V'omar Rove says Rove Shmamino Kesher Elyon deoraisa, that the Kesher Elyon, that this knot must be deoraisa, and meaning, really what it means is that a knot is deoraisa, that you have to have a knot. Now here, this is a good photo to look at. What you see in this photo is untied ptilim. As meaning having a knot, as opposed to like what you see in this photo is if you just take, maybe the mitzvah of tzitzis is you just take strings and put them through the hole in the garment. That's it. You don't have to tie it. You don't have to nothing. Maybe tzitzis is, at least deoraisa, take some strings, put it through a hole in the garment, you have tzitzis. So Rava argues that no, having some kind of knot, fastening it in place somehow is midoraisa. What's his argument? Nochamo. V'omar Rava says Rava, Shmamino Kesher Elyon deoraisa, that this knot, or at the very least having some knot, is midoraisa, some way to fasten the strings to the garment is midoraisa. Because if it enters your mind that really midoraisa, you don't need a knot. Really midoraisa is like you could see in this photo, the untied ptilim. If midoraisa to be yotze the mitzvah of tzitzis, really all you need to do is take some strings and put it through a hole in the corner of a garment. Well, if that's the case, then the Torah would not need to specifically permit shatnez by tzitzis, right? What does the pasuk say? Yesterday I struggled through it a little bit. Here I have it today. What is it? Ubeged. Yeah, great. I have it here, right? Losil b'shadnes, right? Losil b'shadnes tzemur fishtim yachtov, right? The pasuk says in the Torah, where is it? Devarim Chaf Beis. Where's probably Parshas Kiseitze or something? Losil b'shadnes tzemur fishtim yachtov. Don't wear shatnes, wool and linen together. Immediately followed by Gedilim taiseloch alaba kanfos ksuscha asher tchasebo. Make tzitzis. So the juxtaposition of don't wear shatnez, wear tzitzis, we learn from that, from the Hekish, we learn out that even though shatnez is usur, the Torah is telling us, but in the context of tzitzis, it's mutter. I.e., tzitzis by definition, if you were to have wool and linen, let's say a woolen garment, linen strings, let's say. So even though that would normally be kilayim, it normally would be shatnez, but because we're talking about tzitzis, it's okay. So says Rava, the fact that the Torah is saying that even though normally a tzitzis made of, let's say, a woolen garment and linen strings would be shatnez, in the case of tzitzis, it's not shatnez, which means clearly that tzitzis has to be tied in a way that normally would be shatnez. The thing is taking strings and just putting them through a hole and not fastening them anyway is not shatnez. You have to fasten them somehow, as we're going to see in a second. So from the fact that the Torah goes out of its way to say that shatnez is lifted, is waived when it comes to tzitzis, clearly the tzitzis are being tied in a way that would be normally shatnez, i.e. you have to tie the tzitzis and fasten them to the garment. So we see therefore that making that knot is clearly mideoraisa, because if it wasn't, then the Torah wouldn't have to tell us that shatnez is permitted by tzitzis, because tzitzis doesn't actually need to be made milichatchila in a way that invokes shatnez. So again, from the fact that the Torah permits shatnez by tzitzis clearly requires tying, fastening in a way that actually would be shatnez. Okay. So therefore, again, if it enters your mind that tying tzitzis is only midrabanon, that really you don't need to tie it at all, you could just put the strings through the hole and leave them. So my itztrich lemishrei sudden b'tzitzis. Why would the Torah have to specifically tell us that shatnez is okay when it comes, that wool and linen is okay when it comes to tzitzis? Obviously, it's okay. It's not like you're tying it or anything. Pshita. Because after all, the final Mishnah in Mishnayis Masechta Kelim, the final Mishnah is Hatokev Tchifa Achas Eino Chibur. In the final Mishnah of Masechta Kelayim, it says that if you take fabric of wool and you take fabric of linen and you put them next to each other and you take a thread and you go up on the wool and then you go over the fabric and stitch down, that is not considered connecting them in order to be kilayim. You'd have to do one more stitch and fasten it a little better. So we see that applied to tzitzis, just taking the strings and putting them to the hole wouldn't invoke shatnez. So rather, from the fact that the Torah has to permit shatnez by tzitzis, clearly means that the strings are not just being left there, but rather they're being fastened, they're being tied to the garment. So says Rava that the kesher elyon, or at least having some kesher there, is mida oraisa. Givaldi. Drink a stick of water. We're going to go weiter. Amar Rabba bar Rav Ada, Amar Rav Ada, Amar Rab, im nifsak achut meikaro psula. Okay, I have another photo over here that basically where the blue arrow is pointing to, if the thread of the tzitzis, if any of the threads of the tzitzis break by where it's connected to the garment, by the hole in the garment, the threads come through, and then you tie your first knot. If between the first knot of the gedil and where it's tied looped into the garment, and that if those threads at their source, at the where it's tied into the garment, if any of them are snapped, it's not salvageable. Done. The tzitzis are possible. You're gonna have to retie them. So again, Amar Rabba bar Rav Ada, Amar Rav Ada, Amar Rab, nifsak achut meikaru, if the thread snaps at its source where it goes through the hole in the garment, if any of them are snapped, psula, the tzitzis are pasul. Yosef Rav Nachman, v'kamer la'ashmaita, Rav Nachman was sitting and saying over this teaching. Eisvei Rava Rav Nachman, but Rava asked the following question to Rav Nachman, Bamidvar Mamurim, when do we say that there's a specific size for the tzitzis, right? That the strings, that the gdil and the patil need a certain size. We haven't gotten here yet. It's not going to be on today's stuff, but we're going to learn about it in the next few days. That there's a certain length, a certain size that is required for the tzitzis. When is this so? B'tchilaso, when you are initially making the. I hope I didn't say tefillin. If ever I say tefillin today, I most likely mean tzitzis, just in case I'm saying tefillin. So, b'tchilaso, when making the tzitzis, and obviously you have to make them kosher, so they have to be made kosher, and there are shiurim that are necessary. Certain things are necessary when making the tzitzis. Aval besofo, but if the tzitzis were made kosherly and then they became pasul somehow, shiyarav v'gardumav kolshu. The shiyarav and the gardumav, even if there's only a kolshu of them, the tzitzis are kosher. My shiyarav umay gardumav, as I'm sure we are all wondering, what is shiyarav and what is gardumav? Well, The Gemara is also trying to figure out what those are. My love, is it not talking about Shiyarov the Ifsik Minayu v'Ishtir Minayu? Is the Shiyarov not that, i.e., we want to suggest that the Shiyara are that the Ptil snapped, and the Shiyarav are what's left of the Ptil, of the strings after the Gedil. The Igardum Igardume, where am I? Gardumov, the Igardume, and Gardumov is that it snapped. It snapped at its source, i.e. Nifsak Achut Me'ikaro, like we saw in the previous slide, where it breaks, where it comes through the hole. So we want to say, and even so, it is still kosher. Lo, no. Chado Katani, it is teaching one thing, Shiyure Gardumov Kolshu, that when the Pitil snaps and some of the threads are left there, some of the thread is left in the Pitil, it is kosher. Velema Gardumov Shiarav Lamali, so why do I need both Shiyarav and Gardumov? Hakamashman is teaching Tibainan Shiyura li Gardumov Kedela Anvan. Well, because it's teaching that you need a Shiyur in the threads enough to tie them in a slip knot like we had seen yesterday. Okay, fine. That was a little bit technical. Let's talk halacha l'maisa because it's a very important question, right? I have a slide here. I have a halacha l'maisa slide over here that our tzitzis is still kosher if the threads are broken. Very, very practical and relevant question. A string breaks on your tzitzis. Are the tzitzis kosher or not? Very, very relevant question. It happens. Tzitzis break. What do you do? So the Shulchan Aruch says in Orach Chaim, Siman Yud Beis, Seif Aleph. So basically the Shulchan Aruch gives two opinions. He gives one opinion, then the Rabbeinu Tam. Okay? What's the first opinion that he says? Listen up, friends. I made this slide in the easiest way to understand. And I think that the slide is easy to understand. When you scratch the surface just a little bit, you realize it gets a little bit trickier. But if you stick to the principles that I laid out in the slide, and if you just make sure that you're applying the principles I laid out in the slide, then you know the answer to this question. What do you do if the tzitzis snap? So the first opinion is that for every string, right, the tzitzis are made up of four strings that have been doubled into 8. So for every string, i.e. of the 4 strings, the full strings, at least one end, right, because you put the string through the hole in the tzitzis, now there are 2 ends dangling down. At least one of the ends that's coming out of the gedil must have enough slack to be able to tie it in a slip knot. Okay, so you can have, according to the first opinion, all of the strings of the tzitzis can be broken some way or another. Make sure that for all of the 4 strings, at least one end is long enough to be able to make a slip knot. Now, where does it get tricky? Well, how do you know which ends, right? Meaning, if you made your own tzitzis, let's say, and you know that all of the strings on this side started on that side, and all the strings on that side started on that side, so you know that basically, theoretically, you can have all 4 of the strings on the right side, let's say, be cut all the way down to the knot, so long as the strings on the other side all have at least enough to tie in a slip knot, you're good. Because if you tied them yourself, you know that on each side there are 4 separate strings, and you know that basically each string has at least enough to tie a slip knot for at least one string. But anyways, okay, that's the principle for number 1. Okay, is that for every string, at least one side has to have enough slack in order to be able to tie in a slip knot. Rabbeinu Tam, however, says the same thing as opinion 1. He just adds one other thing, which is that 2 threads, 2 of the 4, have to be 100% intact, right? But that's based on what we learned yesterday with Rebbe, what Rav had said yesterday, that when it comes to the stubs of the tzitzis, if the white strings get stubbed, but the tcheles are intact, or the tcheles get stubbed, but the white strings are intact. So therefore, since the 4 strings that we have now, theoretically, 2 of them represent tcheles, 2 of them represent the lavan. So therefore, two of them, just like we described yesterday in the Gemara, the white ones can get snapped, but the blue ones have to be intact. So here also, two of them have to be 100% intact. So Rabbeinu Tam says two of them have to be untouched, and of the remaining two, as long as you can tie them, but one end of the remaining two is tieable in a slip knot, then it is kosher. Okay. Now it sounds more basically. Wait, let's stop here for a second. Basically, if one of your strings of your tzitzis snaps, even down to the knot, you're fine. You're totally fine, right? If two of them snap, well, then it's already more of a question, right? Because if you tie the tzitzis yourself and you know that all the strings on the that are on the same side are unique strings because their other end is on the other side. If you tied it yourself, or even if you bought it from somebody you trust, or whatever, it sounded like the Shulchan Aruch wasn't too fussed. If you can, that was my impression, that basically if you could feel pretty confident that all the strings on the side are unique strings, well then, even according to Rabbeinu Tam, you can even have two of them from the same side that snap. Once already you have one that snaps from this side and one from the other side, you already have to be concerned that maybe it's two ends of the same string, and then you'd have to make sure that you have at least a enough on one side to make a slip knot. But that's the basic gist of it. If one of them snaps down, you're fine. Even two of them, if you can assume that they're unique, you're also fine. Anyways, but additionally, as we said before, all the strings must not be broken where they are connected to the garment. They have to be intact where they're connected to the garment, which we referred to as nifsak achut meikaro. That can't be, that's possible. And now, for conclusion, the Mechaber says the halacha is like opinion number one, that even all of them can be broken, just make sure that on one side it's enough to make a slip knot. However, where possible, it is recommended to follow Rabbeinu Tam's opinion, where the Ramah says our minig is to follow Rabbeinu Tam. And therefore, you should make sure that two of them are completely intact, and then of the other ones, make sure that they both have at least one side that you can make a slip knot. That is the halacha. I took the time to include this here because I think it's just a very important. It's an important halacha. What do you do if your tzitzit snaps? So that's the halacha. Friends, moving on now to how to tie tzitzis. Yosef Rabba v'ka'amar mishmei de Rab. Rabba was saying the name of Rab, Chut shel kerech ola min aminyan, that the wrapper arounder string is part of the 8, right? So when we talk about 8 strings, sometimes I might say 4 strings, sometimes I might say 8 strings. It's a little bit difficult to be consistent here, but basically, if I'm talking about 4 strings, I'm talking about the entire 4 entire strings. If I'm talking about 8 strings, I'm talking about 4 entire strings that have been cut in, that divided in half. I'm going to assume that we all know what I'm talking about by divided in half. Put through the hole, let to dangle down. Okay. So basically, there. If you haven't seen it before, if you haven't never seen kind of raw, I don't know if raw is the right word, but tzitzis strings. Like for example, if you're going to make tzitzis on your own, so there is one string, the wrapper string, that is much longer than all the others because that's the one that has to wrap around a whole bunch of times. So the wrapper one is one of the 8. Okay? The wrapper one is one of the 8 or one of the 4, whatever. Okay. So Yosef Rabba v'ka'amar mishmei de Rav. So Rabba was saying the name of Rab. Chut shel kerech ola min aminyan. That the wrapper string is one of the strings. It's one of the strings, not a separate string. Of Yosef. So if Yosef says to Rabba, Shmuel Amra v'lo Rab. This was not from Rab, it was from Shmuel. Okay. Hidmanami is also said, Rabba bar Chana. Sach li Rabbi Yoshia ben Usha. Okay, Rabbi Yoshia ben Usha told me. Interestingly, the Gilion as Mishmei de Shmuel, the name of Shmuel, which is interesting that Rabbi Bar Chana is usually associated with Eretz Yisrael, with Rabbi Yochanan, and he's saying the name of Rabbi Yoshia ben Usha, which is a place in Eretz Yisrael, quoting Shmuel, which is interesting, who was in Babble. But anyways, Chut shel kerech ole la min aminyan, that the wrapper string is one of the strings. Now, Chavre, before we do this next Gemara, I want to jump down. I think just to make this Gemara make sense, I want to jump down. You don't have to jump down with me. It's literally just a few words. I'm going to jump down around 10 lines where it says, I'll tell you what it says. You don't have to jump down with me. V'noye tcheles shlish gdil v'shtei shlishe onof. That preferably, right, what's considered beautiful for tzitzis is when the gedil is, let's say we divide the gedil, if we take all of the length of the gedil and the patil, 1/3 of that length would be gedil, 2/3 would be patil. That's the proportions that's considered beautiful. And I imagine that roughly aligns with what you see. I mean, probably because the Shulchan Aruch kind of says you should do that. So basically you want 1/3 to be gedil, 2/3 to be patil. Now that we know that, Yosef Rabba the Ka'amr Mishmei the Shmuel, Rabba said the name of Shmuel, Tcheles Shekarach Ruba Kishera. That by tzitzis, if the gedil is more than 50% of the total, not just 33%, but more than 50%, kshera, it is nonetheless kshera. Amalei, Rav Yosef says to Rabba, Rav Amrav lo Shmuel. Shmuel was not the author, it was Rab. Itmar, Nami was also stated, Amar Rav Huna bar Yehuda, Amar Rav Sheshes, Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav Tcheles shekarach ruba kshera, same thing. That if the majority of the tzitzis is the gedil, it is nonetheless kshera. Rav Chia Brei de Rav Nosson Masni Hachi. Rav Chia Brei de Rav Nosson teaches it in the following way: Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Sheshes, Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav Tcheles shekarach ruba kshera. Also, that if the majority of the tzitzis is the gedil, it is nonetheless kosher. Okay. Now, here we go. Friends, do you remember what the chulia is? The chulia are the loops that are between the knots, right? Remember, there were 5 knots, right? Also, when it comes to tzitzis, as we're going to learn, it comes up in Tosfos already today. We're going to learn it, I think, Gimel in Rashi, that of course the gematria of tzitzis is 600 plus the 8 strings and 5 knots is 613 mitzvahs. That's how we know that, or that's, I don't know if that's how we know, but we say that tzitzis is connected call all of the mitzvahs. The Gemara says that. And Rashi explains that it's for that reason, the gematria. Okay. Now, why am I saying this? To remember that there are 5 knots. Okay, that there are 5 knots in the tzitzis, and we said that the chulia are the loops between the knots, right? The space between the knots is the chulia. So says the Gemara, even if you only have 1 chulia, it's kosher. We have 4 standard tzitzis, right? Not tchelis. We'll get into tchelis in a minute. But standard tzitzis has kind of 5 knots, and in between the 5 knots there are 4 spaces, and so we have 4 chulias. Now, the Shulchan Aruch Taka says that actually there isn't any amount of like wrappings around that you need. We do 7, 8, 11, 13, which is Taka an interesting thing. So the Shulchan Aruch Taka says that there isn't a specific amount of wrapping that you have to do in between, right, for each chulia. He says, however, that the minhag is, at least for our tzitzis, for the lavon tzitzis, we're about to learn all about tchelis tzitzis, but for the lavon, the Mishnah Berurah, the Shulchan Aruch says, the Mechaber says from the Beis Yosef to do 7 in the first chulia, followed by 9, not 8, but 9 in the second chulia, followed by 11, followed by 13. The Mishnah Berurah, however, says, like we do, or at least like I'm aware of, 7, 8, 11, 13. Why 7, 8, 11, 13? Because 7 and 8 is 15, which is Yud Hey. And then you add, the next chulia is 11, 15 and 11 is 26, which is Yud Kei Vav Kei. And then 13 is Echad, so it's like Hashem Echad. Isn't that cool? Right, that the 7, 8, 11, 13 of the wrappings of the chulias are connected Hashem Echad. Anyways, so says the Gemara, so vafilo karach ba el chulia achas ksher meikar adin. Even if you just have 1 chulia, not 4 or however many, it's sufficient. V'noye tcheles shlish gedil v'shnei shlishei anaf. As I read earlier, that what's considered beautiful for tzitzis is 1/3 gedil, 2/3 patil. V'shcham ashir chulia. How many wrappings around is a chulia? Tanya, we learn in the Brisa, Rebbe Omer says, Rebbe Kadesh Yichroch v'yishane v'yishalish. 3 wrappings. Again, I said from the Shulchan Aruch that technically there's no amount. I think that's Mida Oraisa. But anyways, forget about that right now. The Gemara says that a chuliyah is 3. Maker din a chuliyah is 3 wrappings. Again, we do 7, 8, 11, 13. Says the Gemara, Maker adin, a chuliyah is 3 loops. Tana, we learn in a Brisa, Hapoches lo yifchos misheva, ve'amosif lo yosif al shalosh. Somebody who does, so the minimum is 7. I'm sorry, al shloshes. I'm sorry, right? So again, Hapoches lo yifchos misheva, ve'amosif lo yosif al shloshes. The minimum is 7, the maximum is 13. The minimum what? So Rashi says the minimum of chulios. Okay, we're going to see in a second that the Rambam says that too. The Ravid disagrees. The Ravid says that it's talking about the tchelis, but we'll get that. We'll get there. But let's assume now that it's talking about the chulios. Okay, so each chulia has 3 loops, and there's a minimum, let's say, of 7 chulios, maximum of 13. V'apoches lo yifchos misheva kineged sheva rakim. The reason why the minimum number of chulios is 7 is kineged the 7 rakiyas. V'amosif lo yosef al shloshes, and you shouldn't have more than 13. Kineged shiva rakim v'shisha avirin shebeneim. 13 would represent the 7 heavens plus the 6 spaces that are in between them. 7 and 6 is 13. Because we know, as we're going to learn in a few days, tcheles dome layom v'yom dome larakiyah, that the tzitzis have tcheles in them. Tcheles is like the color of the sea. It is similar to the sea, which is similar to the heavens. And therefore, in the tzitzis themselves, we have a number of chuliyot corresponding to the number of heavens, and with a minimum of 7 and a maximum of 13, which represents the 7 heavens and the spaces between them. Let's just go a little bit weiter before we start looking at some interesting tcheles shitas. Tana, we learn in the Brisa, that when tying, you begin tying with a white thread. Right? There's of course tcheles and there's lavon. So you begin with a white thread rather than a blue thread. Because akonof min konof. Because the pasuk says akonof and then it says psil tcheles. So akonof means the same type as the konof. Assuming that now we're talking about, let's say, a woolen garment which is white. So we're talking about min konof, a white string first. And then it says followed by psil tcheles. U'chshu mesayim beloved. And when you finish wrapping, the final wrap should also be with white, because because if we start with a white string, right, we have white available, we have blue available. If we're starting with white and we're prioritizing white, it must be that white is higher than, right, the lavon is higher than the tcheles, which is why we start with it. And if it's higher than the tcheles, then if we start with the white, which is higher, and end with the tcheles, which is lower, so then it would be moridin bakodesh, we would be descending in holiness. But mailin bakodesh, we go up in kodesh, we don't go down. So therefore, just like we start with the white, so then we also finish with the white in order to maintain mailin bakodesh, going up in holiness rather than going down. Okay, fine. Givaldim. So we learned. Let's have a look at how the Rambam ties tcheles. The reason why I want to have a look at how the Rambam ties tcheles, because when looking at how the Rambam ties tcheles, it's like basically a summary of this Gemara. Looking at how the Rambam ties tcheles, I think is like the easiest way to kind of like summarize this Gemara. So let's take a look at how the Rambam wraps tcheles. It's super interesting. So this is the Rambam 13. We'll see in a second the Rambam 7, which already is super interesting, right? Because we had said, right, you shouldn't have less than 7, you shouldn't have more than 13. So see the Rambam, so if you see, what's going on here in the Rambam's tcheles is you see 13 chuliot. Each chulia is 3 threads. Beginning with a white thread, right? The first chulia is 3 wraps. The first one is a white wrap, right? Because we said start with white. So it goes white, blue, blue, and then the next 11 of them are blue, blue, blue. There are 3 blues, right? So each chulia is 3 wraps of blue. And then the 13th chulia is 2 wraps of blue, followed by a wrap of white, again to finish with white, like we said, to start and finish with white. What else is interesting about what else do we see here that is interesting? First of all, there's a knot at the very beginning. That seems to be it, just a proper knot at the beginning. And what else am I missing over here? Am I missing anything? We have these chuliot of 3. We have 13 of them. I can't remember if I'm missing something, but it's super cool to basically just see how it sounds like he's basically just taking the Gemara and kind of applying it directly to the tzitzis like that. One thing that I do want to point out, which is super interesting about the Rambam, is that, so of course there are 4 threads that are divided in half to get 8 threads. So we had seen I think yesterday probably, from Rashi and Tosfos that they say, and we've been assuming that 2 of the threads are tcheles, 2 of the threads are lavam. According to the Rambam, 1 of the 8 threads are tcheles. 7 out of the 8 threads are white. What does that mean? It means that essentially you have 3.5 white threads and 1/2 a blue thread. How interesting is that? You have half a thread that's dyed blue, the other half is white, and then the other three are white. Okay, I hope I didn't forget to say anything. I feel like I probably forgot to say one thing, but I can't. I don't know. I think we basically have what we needed from the Gemara. The next what we have here is the Rambam 7, right? So what's super interesting here is that it's basically the same thing as the 13, just there's only 7, because as we saw in the Mishnah, as we saw in the Gemara, it shouldn't be any less than 7 and no more than 13. So there's the Rambam 7, there's the Rambam 13. Now the Ravid, right there in the Rambam. Now, Cheva, I had been hearing, where I grew up, so I guess at a certain point, kids in town started to get tcheles. I guess I have to imagine that when my father grew up, nobody had tcheles, is my guess. But at a certain point, when my childhood, kids started getting tcheles, all of a sudden, people start tying their tcheles like the Ravid. Never heard of the Ravid before, but all of a sudden, apparently, the Ravid ties tcheles a certain way. This is how he ties the tcheles. Whoever was wearing tcheles, I guess they most likely it was a whole thing. You tie it like Ravid, you tie it like the Rambam, you can tie it like Tosfos, okay. Or you just do it the regular way, and you tie it normally just with tcheles. This is the Ravid. The Ravid says to the Rambam, first of all, I don't know where the Rambam says that, the Ravid says, I don't know where the Rambam gets that there's half a string of tcheles. He says it's one of the strings are tcheles. He also says, why is the Rambam using so much blue? Who says that, right, that all of the chuliot need to be tcheles? And therefore, the Ravid says, it needs to be tcheles. So when we say that there are, but that don't have less than 3 in the chuliah, it means don't have less than 3 wraps of blue. So if you notice on the first wrap, there's actually 3 wraps of blue. Right, I think that so the first wrap, there's I think 7 wraps. So you have the first one is white, the last one is white, and then there are 6 in the middle, and 3 of them are going to be tcheles. So that's what the 3 need to be. And then at the Ravid, I think it's a little bit more complicated about exactly the shita. So my focus wasn't like to go into the Ravid shita, but to show you kind of this kind of famous shita of the Ravid in wrapping tzitzis. But I think the others don't necessarily need to be 7 per se. But anyways, yeah, he argues in terms of, he says that it is 1 whole string, which is also different than Rashi and Tosfos, who said 2 strings of tcheles. He says 1 string of tcheles, and he says that when the chulia needs to be 3, it means 3 of tcheles. Okay. And finally, the last tcheles shita we're going to look at is the shita of Tosfos. So if you look at Tosfos, so he's got the 5 knots. He maintains the 5 knots that we have. And what he does, if you could see, is basically so each chulia, he does it like the Rambam did, in that a chuliah is going to be three loops. And what he does is, he does 3 loops, starting with the white threads. Right? So what he does is, if you at the top there's a knot, okay, the first of the 5 knots, double knots, and then you wrap 3 times white thread, which is, so you're starting with white, and that's 1 chuliah. You then wrap 3 times blue, that's a second chuliah of blue. Then you tie a double knot. You do again white, blue, knot, white, blue, and a knot, followed by just white. So what you have there is 2, 2, 2, and 1 is 7. So you have 7 chuliot, starting with white and ending with white, and he also has the 5 knots there. Anyways, we're going to end there with the different shitas, but I thought it was super interesting to take the Gemara and kind of see how it's applied in different ways. I feel like we've probably all seen people wear tcheles in different ways, and it's interesting to kind of see how the different Rishonim are taking what the Gemara says and applying it in different ways. let's actually now just look at our standard tzitzis for a second. I think, said everything that I wanted to say about it. So we already talked about the 7, 8, 11, 13. But there you can see, of course, our standard tzitzis, 5 knots, and in between there are 4 chuliyot in between the 5 knots. The first one has 7, followed by 8, followed by 11, followed by 13. I don't think that there's anything else that I want to say about that. Rav and Rabbi Bar Chana were sitting. A certain fellow passed by. He was wearing a garment that was entirely blue. It was entirely tchelis. And he had tzitzis, the gedila migdil, and it was entirely gedil. It was a stump. There was no pitil. Amar Rab Yoyi Glima, Rav says, nice garment, velo Yoyi Tchelta, however, the tzitzis are insufficient. Rabbi Bar Chana Amar Yoyi Glima, v'Yoyi Tchelta. Rabbi Bar Chana says, great garment, and the tzitzis are fine as well. But Micah, what's the machlokes between Rav and Rabbi Bar Chana? So, but Micah, wait, okay, fine. Rabbi Bar Chana, so Rabbi Bar Chana holds ksiv gedil uchsev ptil. Right, one pasuk says gedilim taiselach. Another pasuk in a different sefer says akonof psil techeles. O gdil o psil. Rabbi Bar Chana says you can have, it's okay even if you have just gedil or just pisil. And this guy is just gedil and it's fine. V'Rav Sava, whereas Rav holds le'olam pisil ba'inan. No, you need pisil. You gotta have gedil and you gotta have pisil. V'ahu gedilim, and in terms of what to learn from gedilim, it's not that you can have either or, but rather it teaches the minyanu da'asa to tell us that you need how many strings you need. Gedil shnayim, that gedil means 2, because I think the point is that in order to wrap it properly, you would have to have at least 2 strings. You wouldn't just wrap it around itself, I think. Gedilim arba, but it doesn't just say gedil, it says gedilim, multiple of 2 strings, i.e. 4 strings. Say gedil ufosleu mitocho. So what it's saying is, make gedilim, have these 4 threads, and have these petilim coming out of it. So Rav says you need both gedil and petil. Okay. The Gemara is now going to discuss both which garments have a chiyuv of tzitzis and which threads are usable as tzitzis. Here we go. Amar Shmuel Mishmei de Levi. Shmuel says in the name of Levi, Chute Tzemer Potrin Bisel Pishton, that woolen, right, if you have a linen garment, so then even if all 4 strings are wool, that is fine. That is fine. If you have a linen garment, then even if all 4 strings are wool, that is fine. Now the Shulchan Aruch Taka says that nowadays, because we don't have tcheles, of course, is the way that the mitzvah is supposed to be done, with tcheles. Now, since the assumption in the Shulchan Aruch and all the Rishonim stuff is that we don't have tcheles. Obviously now we've discovered the chilazon and people have tcheles. I don't know much about the whole discussion about the arguments and stuff, but I mean, Rav Hershel Shechter wears tcheles. I mean, I imagine Rav Hershel Shechter wears tcheles. I imagine there and many other very important people. I imagine that there's plenty to say about it. But the assumption in the Shulchan Aruch and stuff is that we don't have tcheles now, and based on, so the Shulchan Aruch says, Taka, since we don't have tcheles and we don't have sort of tzitzis in its proper way, so therefore this concept that we're learning about we've been discussing as well of gedilim taiselach, lo suba shatnez gedilim taiselach, that you're allowed to have shatnez when it comes to tzitzis. We don't do it nowadays because we don't anyways have tzitzis, kamosh tzarich anyways, but the Gemara is assuming that shatnez is not a problem when it comes to tzitzis. And the Gemara says if you have a linen garment with 4 woolen threads, it's completely fine. Okay, fine. So Mishmei de Levi Chute Tzemer, woolen threads, potrin bishel pishton, will be kosher and satisfy the tzitzis obligation when it comes to woolen threads for a linen garment. Ibarlu, they ask a kasha, however, shall pishton mau sheyifteru b'shel tzemer. But what if you have a woolen garment? Can you use linen threads for a woolen garment? Why not? What's the consideration? Well, tzemer b'shel pishtim, I can understand why 4 woolen strings will be sufficient for linen. Because maybe I'll say tzemer b'shel pishtim with the potter dechevin the tcheles patra lovanami potter. Well, because anyways, obviously tcheles is going to work, right? I mean, tzitzis is supposed to be with tcheles. Now, tcheles by definition is wool. You dye wool, and that's what tcheles is. You're not going to have linen tcheles. Tcheles is wool. So therefore, if you have a linen garment, ideally you're going to have at least 2. According to Rashi, it is 2, but according to Rav, it will be 1. According to Rambam, a half, whatever it is. But the point is that because of tcheles, memele, on a linen garment, there is going to be wool strings to some extent. As part of the tzitzis on a linen garment, there's going to be wool. So therefore, I can understand what, by definition, there's already going to be wool. So once already we're saying that there's going to be wool as tcheles, so it's not so crazy to take another leap and say that even all 4, right? Clearly, wool is acceptable for linen, for a linen garment, and therefore to take kind of a further leap and say that all 4 woolen strings are acceptable for a linen garment is also fine. But if I'll pishtim bitzemer lo, but maybe I'll say that for a woolen garment, there's no reason why we need to be using linen threads. So maybe you can't use linen threads for a wool garment. You can use linen threads for a linen garment, but maybe not for a woolen garment. Odilma, or perhaps kim dichsib lo silba shatnes tzemer fishtim Yachtov, since the pasuk says don't wear shatnes, but immediately followed by gedilim taiselach, make tzitzis. So it says don't wear shatnes, tzemer ufishtim, wool and linen, and then it says gedilim taiselach, make tzitzis, lo shna tzemer bepishtim, velo shna pishtim bitzemer. It doesn't matter whether you're using woolen strings for a linen garment or linen strings for a woolen garment; they're interchangeable, right? We say Tzemer ufishtim yachtov, gdilim taiselach, they're interchangeable. So that is our question, right? Certainly 4 woolen strings are sufficient for a linen garment, but what about using linen strings for a woolen garment? Toshma de Amr Rachba Amr of Yehuda, chute tzemer potrin bishel pishton, that woolen threads work for a linen garment, bishel pishton potrin bishel tzemer, and similarly, linen threads work for a woolen garment. Chutei tzemer ufishtim potrin b'chol makom. Additionally, having 2 threads of wool as tcheles and 2 threads of linen for the lavon is always going to be sufficient. Va'afilu b'shirayin, even for linen, which is very interesting because now we're starting to get into the alternative materials. So interestingly, we're saying that having 4 strings, 2 of them woolen tcheles, 2 of them linen, work as tzitzis, okay, because we know gdilim taiselach, right? Lo subashan is temafishim yachtav gdilim taiselach. But what's very interesting is that even works for a silk garment. Why is that interesting? Well, it means clearly then that a silk garment is chayav in tzitzis mida oraisa, because if mida oraisa, a silk garment, was patur from tzitzis, well then you're putting shatnez on a garment for no reason. If silk is chayav in tzitzis mida oraisa, well then, okay, we said by tzitzis, shatnez is waived, and you can use 2 woolen and 2 linen strings. But if mida oraisa silk is patur from tzitzis, well then we have no business putting shatnez on that garment. Ufliga de Rav Nachman, now this argues with Rav Nachman. Now we're getting into the question of which garments are chayav in tzitzis. Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman, hashirayin pturin minat tzitzis. Because Rav Nachman holds that only wool and linen are chayav in tzitzis. No other garments are chayav in tzitzis midoraisa. And therefore it says, Rav Nachman, silk is potter from tzitzis. And therefore, since silk is potter from tzitzis, you can't, if you want to put tzitzis on it, you can't be putting on 2 wool and 2 linen strings. Different types of silk. Kulan chayavin b'tzitzis. The Brisa says that all these different types of silks are chayav in tzitzis. Midirabonon. Rav Nachman say they're chayav midirabonon. Sure. Midaraisa, only wool and linen garments need tzitzis. If that's the case, ema seifa. But the Brisa continues, v'chulon semer ufishtin potin bohen. That for all these silks, wool and linen work for tzitzis. As we said a few minutes ago, I understand if we say, and we're assuming for now, that what does it mean that for these materials, wool and linen work? Wool and linen together. 2 tcheles and 2 wool and tcheles and 2 linen. 2 white linen work for these silks. So I understand the oraisa. I understand if we say that silk is chayiv in tzitzis, not just derabanan but the oraisa. That's why we can have kilayim, 2 woolen threads and 2 linen threads. But if you say that silk is chayiv in tzitzis only midirabanan, heichi mishteri bi'u kilayim. How can we be putting kilayim on a silk garment if it's not chayiv and tzitzis midoraisa? Ema otzemer opishtim. Rav Nachman says, not a big deal. I'll say, what does it mean that you're putting wool and linen on this silk garment? Either wool or linen, but not together, because midoraisa it's part from tzitzis. Hachinam mistavra, and Rav Nachman continues that I'll also argue that, and this makes sense to say dikatani seifa, because it says, Hein atzman b'minon potrin, shelo b'minon ein potrin, that when it comes to silk garments, you can use silk strings for silk garments, but not for any other garments. And continues of Nachman, Yomid b'shloma d'Rabbanon, hainu demifteru b'minon. Argues of Nachman, it's because silk is only chayiv and tzitzis mid'Rabbanon that you can use silk strings for a silk garment. If you say that silk is chayiv and tzitzis midoraisa, tzemeru fishtimu de potter, you would have to use woolen or linen strings. You wouldn't be able to use silk strings if it was chayiv in tzitzis midoraisa. Imishu mahalo irya, says the Gemara, that's not a good proof, because kiderava de Rava Rami, Rava asks ksiv hakonof min konof. On the one hand, the pasuk says that the hakonof min konof, the tzitzis, the strings should be of the same material as the garment. Uchsiv tzemeru fishtim, but we also specifically talk about wool and linen. Haketzad, how so? Here's the halacha. Tzemer ufishtim potrim bein b'minon bein shelo b'minon. That wool and linen are global. You can use wool and linen on anything. You can use wool and linen strings for wool and linen garments. You can use them for cotton garments, silk garments, hemp garments, whatever you like. You can use wool and linen strings. Shar minin, but when it comes to cotton, silk, hemp, whatever, b'minon potrin shelo b'minon ein potrin. So for a cotton garment, if you want to use cotton strings for a cotton garment, that's fine. Cotton strings for a silk garment, not fine. So Rav Nachman says that you specifically have to use wool and linen garments and strings, whereas Rava says that wool and linen are usable anywhere. When it comes to, let's say, a cotton garment, you can use cotton strings for a cotton garment. You can also use wool and linen, but you can't use cotton for anything else. Rav Nachman kidatana de Rabbi Shmuel. Rav Nachman holds like the Tana de Rabbi Shmuel. The Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, Hoil v'nemu begodim b'Torah stam. Since it says begodim, kanfe begdeichem adorasam, doesn't say what kind of begodim. Ufered l'chakosu be'echomen. It says Rashi that this is a reference to tzaras. That it says by tzaras bebeged semer or bebeged pishtim. So since there the Torah tells us which begodim we're talking about by tzaras. wool and linen. So I've called Semer Ufishtim. So whenever it talks about beged, it means wool and linen. Therefore, Rav Nachman holds like the Tana of Rabbi Yishmael, who says that Kanfei Bigdeichem is specifically wool and linen garments. Only wool and linen garments are chayav in tzitzis, according to Tana of Rabbi Yishmael. Not cotton, not linen, not nothing else. Abai says, Abai, by Tana of Rabbi Yishmael, Mafka Meidoch Tana of Rabbi Yishmael. Abai points out that this Tana of Rabbi Yishmael, this brisa from the Bismedrish of Rabbi Yishmael, argues on a different brisa from the Bismedrish of Rabbi Yishmael. The Tana of Rabbi Yishmael, beged, when it says beged, ainli ela beged semer, all I know is wool. Menan the Rabbi semer gemalim, how do I know about camel wool? Vitsemer arnovim, rabbit wool. Vinotza shel izim, or goat hair. V'akalach basrigim ashiroyin, and different types of silks. Tamlomer o beged. It says o beged, that o is coming to include all sorts of other garments as well. So we see from this other Tana of Rabbi Yishmael that all sorts of garments are chayav in tzitzis. And Rav had also learned earlier, right, from, it says hakonaf min konaf, so whatever the particular material is, but it also says semer ufishtim yachdav, so specifically semer and fishtim. So we said, right, so Rava had said that basically all garments are chayav in tzitzis, but in terms of what strings you can use semer and fishtim, wool, linen for all garments, whereas if you want to use cotton or silk, only for cotton and silk garments respectively. The Shulchan Aruch Taka, the Mechaber paskins like Rav Nachman. The Mechaber paskins like Rav Nachman that only wool and linen garments are chayav midaraisa in tzitzis. However, the Ramah says that we hold, like Rava explained, that all garments are chayav in tzitzis midaraisa. Friends, that was Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Menachos. Friends, on Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Menachos, we learned all about tzitzis, beginning with what to do if tzitzis strings break. We said that there are 3 rules that we need to follow. All of the strings must not be broken where they are connected to the garment. Right, where they are connected to the garment, if they're broken there, forget about it. Even one string. Now, the Mechaber had quoted a first opinion that for every string, at least one end must have enough slack to be able to tie in a slip knot. And then Rabbeinu Tam said that, opinion 1, and also, however, 2 of the 4 strings must be 100% intact. The Mechaber had said that we paskin like opinion number 1, but that you should try to be stringent for Rabbeinu Tam, whereas the Ramah says we paskin like Rabbeinu Tam, 2 of the strings must be 100% intact. And then the other 2 just need to have one side that you can make a slip knot with it. How to tie tzitzis. I am not going to get into all the details now. Basically, the Gemara had told us essentially how to tie tcheles tzitzis. We saw different shitas of the Rambam, the Ravid, Tosfos, of what that could possibly look like. Very, very interesting. Then we also saw kind of the standard tzitzis and what standard tzitzis look like. Which materials are chayav in tzitzis? Rav Nachman says only wool and linen. Rava says all garments are chayav in tzitzis. The Mechaber seems to take a paskin like Rav Nachman, and the Ramah paskins like Rava. And which materials to use for the tzitzis? Threads, wool for anything. You can use the material the garment is made of. And the Ramah says, don't use linen for strings at all nowadays. So says the Ramah, nowadays don't use linen for strings at all. We're concerned about shatnez, and we don't do shatnez anymore, as we had said earlier, since we don't have tcheles, or at least that's kind of the assumption in the Shulchan Aruch, and just use wool for everything. Friends, that was the Daf Lamed Tes of Masechta Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.